Thanks for tuning in. I'm Scott Walter.
And I'm Michael Watson.
In this episode, we go behind the scenes of one of the most divisive issues in modern politics, immigration. This is the InfluenceWatch podcast. Last week, we discussed the current debates over a federal government spending bill and speculated that if a government shutdown occurred, it would be because of wrangling over immigration more than the budget. Sure enough, we could be headed for that very scenario. As we sit here, congressional Democrats are battling the Trump administration over what to do about Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, an Obama administration policy that shielded certain illegal aliens from deportation by executive fiat. The Trump administration rescinded DACA, though a federal court order has temporarily blocked the rescission, but it has expressed a willingness to formally legalize the DACA recipients in exchange for concessions from congressional Democrats on border security and on reforms that will diminish family-based chain migration. But after a heated bipartisan meeting with Senators Lindsey Graham, Tom Cotton, David Perdue, and Dick Durbin, which resulted in the president reportedly using a scatological phrase to describe certain developing countries, prospects for a deal look grim, leaving congressional Republicans to regroup and prepare for another short-term government funding effort. Well, Mike, let's start with just a touch of background on DACA. Where did it come from?
So in 2012, in advance of his reelection, President Obama issued an executive action, an executive order that dictated that illegal immigrants who had arrived in the United States before their 16th birthday and before 2007 and met certain other requirements about education and work, who applied for legal protection would receive legal protection and not be able to be deported. And they would also be able to work legally in the United States.
Now, there was a dispute about whether President Obama had this authority, correct?
Yes. The congressional Republicans said that he didn't. Democrats had the majority in the Senate, so it was hard. There was no real way to adjudicate it. The Trump administration, after President Trump got elected, the Trump administration looked at it and they said, we don't have the authority. And that's why we are now in the situation that we are in.
Of course, as I recall, President Obama for some years had told his own supporters the same thing, that a president lacks this authority.
Right. For a few years, under pressure from the immigration expansionist left, President Obama had said that he could not unilaterally reform immigration. He needed a law in Congress. Once it became clear that he was not going to get a law from Congress that would satisfy him, he acted in this manner.
Yep. And now we just mentioned a moment ago that the current legal status is that a federal judge has said that Trump lacks the authority to do what he has just done. Where does that stand?
That has been appealed. I believe the Department of Justice appealed it directly to the Supreme Court rather than going to the Ninth Circus. And it is the legal watchers, although we can never know and never discern the precise mental state of Anthony Kennedy at any given time, the suspicion is that the Supreme Court will laugh the district court that has stopped the rescission. They will simply laugh them out of court and hold that, yes, the president can issue an executive order reversing an executive order.
Yes, and especially on the question of immigration, where executive power has always been understood to be rather broad.
Yes, executive power. We can argue whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. I am a congressional supremacist and believe it's a bad thing. But the way Congress has given over much of its authority to create a uniform rule of naturalization, as the Constitution says, has given it to the executive discretion, allowing the executive to do lots of things, whether or not Congress wants the executive to do it.
Now, the Trump administration is fighting this hard in the courts. As you said, they took it all the way up to Supreme Court immediately. But on the other hand, they have signaled some willingness to deal in this area. Is that right?
Yes, the Trump administration and President Trump himself have said that they really don't want to take away the status that was given to the relatively young illegal immigrants who were given status by President Obama's executive fiat. So they have said, all right, Democrats, we agree that this population should be given legal status and should probably be given a path. I don't know where they stand on a pathway to citizenship, although a pathway to citizenship would probably come out of any reasonably predictable negotiation. So the Trump administration has said, fine, we'll give you that. But if we're going to do that, I mean, I was elected, President Trump says, I was elected on a promise to build a wall, establish border security, reform immigration in a more restrictionist direction. You have to give me something. And that's where everything is kind of stalled.
Yes. And of course, this made the biggest headlines because of what in the press release language is a full and frank discussion among the president and some Senate leaders. Is that correct?
A full and frank discussion, yeah. So the Senate negotiators, Republican from South Carolina, relatively liberal on immigration, Lindsey Graham, and number 2 Senate Democrat Dick Durbin of Illinois, were going to present their agreement that they had made with some other centrist Republican senators and Democrats. And the president called in 2 of the leading restrictionists, Tom Cotton of Arkansas and David Perdue of Georgia, who have authored a restrictionist immigration proposal that we'll get to later in our discussion. And they had a frank exchange of views that resulted in the president using a colorful phrase that to describe, it is reported that he used it to describe specifically Haiti and Africa, and possibly other less well-off countries. And he compared them to Norway and, depending on who you believe, also possibly East Asia. This, needless to say, has sent the Democrats into a spiraling tizzy. The Cotton and Perdue deny that he said it, implausibly. And Senator Graham, although not explicitly confirming that President Trump said what he said and that Graham actually called him out for having said a particularly nasty thing, Graham all but confirmed it with a non-confirmation confirmation.
Yes. Let's. I can't resist a slight digression on Norway. Couple of points on that would be that Rich Lowry, the editor of National Review, has theorized that one reason the president happened to toss out the name Norway was because he so recently had met with Norwegian officials, and they'd filled him with the wonders of Norway. Personally, I'm a bit skeptical of Scandinavian countries given their strong tendency to secularism and socialism, but it is an even funnier part of this, which I've not seen anybody make the point, is the most famous and highest-ranking White House official of Norwegian background in recent decades was Karl Rove, the so-called architect of George W. Bush's success. Now, Karl, with whom I overlapped a bit in the White House, himself was a vigorous pro-immigration arguer, and he loved to quote 100-year-old newspaper stories and magazine articles about how horrible those Norwegian immigrants are in their ghettos and the bad way they live. And
that's been one of the broader responses to what the president said. My ancestors came from, many of them came from Ireland. When my ancestors would have come over, we haven't done I am not familiar with the precise genealogy, so I don't know exactly when they came over, but we can presume it was the middle of the 19th century. Ireland was not a nice place to live.
The Irish were not governing themselves well, although I believe they would say the English deserve a lot of credit.
The English were malgoverning the island, we would say, and much as parts of the Caribbean and Africa are malgoverned by their governments today, the result was people wanted to go somewhere where they could govern themselves and have economic opportunity, and that's Now, obviously, it's a it's a different time now. The economy's different. Getting your first job on the ladder isn't as easy as signing on with the foreman and working your 16-hour shift at the mill. And of course, when the Irish came over, there wasn't also a welfare state. But the principle that people from lousy places can go on to become not only contributing members of society, but also profoundly contributing members of society, I think is important to indicate. And I think certainly the way it was reported, it seemed like that had escaped President Trump.
Yes. No, I guess you could give an example maybe on either side of this. On the one hand, Europe currently has high levels of immigration in many places from often from people from very messed up countries or very poorly governed countries. And there are serious problems with that, like the rape capital of Europe being in Sweden, for instance, right next to Norway. On the other hand, there would, I suppose, you could give the example of the Chinese. Now, the Chinese nation has not been well governed, arguably, for quite a few centuries. On the other hand, it is it's a very famous example that so-called offshore Chinese, when they are off mainland China and elsewhere in Asia or in Los Angeles or whatnot, are extraordinarily successful, despite having come from a country that has not had a very American way of life in its government, let us say, for a very long time.
Right, and you see that, to choose a country indirectly implicated by the president, one of the highest education levels for immigrants to the United States are from Nigeria, which is a very large country in West Africa. Why is that? Well, the people who have the wherewithal, the people who have the means to come over from there, tend to be at least middle income, reasonably well off, reasonably well educated, and certainly that. And then if you can qualify for our merit immigration system, which is very hard, then you are likely to be very well educated and potentially very well off.
Yes. Well, let's pop back for a second to the politics of this. Politics, as Lincoln said, always depends on public opinion. And what is the apparent public view on DACA?
Every time I bring up issue polling. One of my core beliefs about politics is that issue polling is mostly garbage, but it's all we got. And the issue polling here, depending on the pollster, is reasonably consistent. So I think it gives us a reasonable view on where the public seems to stand, or at least where it's inclined. And it's inclined strongly in favor of at least a rationalization of status, and probably a majority in favor of a path to citizenship. Some of the polls that have come out in recent weeks, I think CBS had it at 70% favor, either legal status or a path to citizenship. Quinnipiac had it at 79.
Now, of course, with the polling like that, as you point out, it often is pretty shaky, and one of the greatest pitfalls, I think, of asking people polls that ask the questions on the order of, do you favor policy X or not? The single greatest failing of that is that they don't ask the critical follow-up question, and do you care?
A great example of a completely different issue where that's a thing is the question of gun background checks. Supposedly, Mike Bloomberg comes out and says, 90% of Americans favor gun background checks. Yeah, but the 10% who care all hate it. Now, do I think just putting on my rank punditry hat that a similar dynamic is pertaining here? No, I think there is a very strong advocacy in favor, largely from communities that have large numbers of DACA, DACA recipients. Do I think there is a staunchly opposed minority? Yeah, sure. Do I think it's very large? No.
Yes. Well, we'll see how that works in the in how all this plays out. Now, you mentioned a little bit ago about Trump making the argument, look, I won an election where one of my single biggest issues was saying we need to build a wall in order to have stronger border security. Is there much willingness among the Democrats to fund anything that the president could call a wall?
Not to enough that he could actually build something and cut a ribbon and say, look at my wall. The bill, the proposal that was presented in the meeting that led to the scatological phrase being used, I think had a couple billion. John Kelly, Trump's chief of staff, says he wants 20. The Democrats, because of their base politics, do not want anything that can be called a wall. Now, this morning's tweets laid aside, because who knows what those are worth, over the last few months, basically since he got elected, Trump has stepped back from his insistence that it be, a solid wall all the way across the continent, that we have. In an interview with Sean Hannity back in December of, I think, 2016, he said, we have vicious rivers. Obviously, you can't build a wall in the middle of the Rio Grande. If you think of the wall as sort of a symbol of border security, that would be a physical barrier in some places and, extra border agents and swift boats and all that in some other places, there is some willingness to give some, but not very much, and not enough that Trump can say, I've won a concession for my side.
Plus, of course, that's not the only factor in having illegal aliens in America. There's also the issue of people who come in legally but then do not leave when they were legally required to leave and overstay their visas, and that has also been a big factor here.
One of the bringing up brings up the Irish again. A lot of people come over on student visas, temporary work visas, and then not the Irish, but other places on refugee and other temporary statuses. They establish a life here, they get a job, and then their 6 months or their 8 months or their couple years runs out, and then they don't leave. And the estimates say that maybe up to half of the annual illegal immigrant inflow, which is lower than it has been in past years, may be from people who overstay legal status. Now, some of them, they mess up for administrative reasons and then they go home. Others are actually trying to stay.
Yeah. So in a overarching policy way of looking at this would be that one side stresses what they would call family reunification and what their critics would call chain migration, where one family member can bring more family members.
Let me kind of explain how the chain theory, a theoretical chain would work. You admit an immigrant for, let's say that they're admitted maybe on an investor visa, an immigrant's investor visa, or they're a work-sponsored immigrant. That immigrant can then use once that immigrant becomes a U.S. citizen, and they can bring over as a permanent resident, but with time lags and a couple of asterisks, their immediate family. But let's assume that they get naturalized, then they bring over their immediate family as permanent residents. They can also sponsor family preference, which is for siblings. I believe it's siblings, parents, and adult children. And on family preference, with some asterisks and a fairly substantial time lag, our immigrant could bring over his brother. And then once his brother, 5 to 7 years down the road, got his U.S. citizenship, he could then bring over his family. And so critics of immigration say that creates a theoretically endless chain of new immigrants. There are several asterisks. that I think it's fair to point out. One, obviously, not every immigrant is necessarily going to sponsor their siblings and parents and so forth coming over. There are substantial time lags in between when you can petition. You can ask the government, please put these people in my family preference line in line for immigration, and when they actually would end up qualifying for a green card. And then, when you come over for a green card, that's your permanent residency. I believe it's 5 years down the road. You can then apply for citizenship, assuming you meet the requirements. This is a many, many year process, and a human lifespan puts some boundaries on the length of a chain that you could create.
Yep. Of course, on the flip side, the folks on the other side of the argument, including presumably the president, would say other countries routinely screen the immigrants that they permit. For instance, our Canadian neighbors to the north, not known particularly for their own vicious racism, but they have a much more merit-based system, do they not, for allowing immigrants in? And if one wanted to interpret the president's remarks charitably, it would be, why shouldn't we be getting the creme de la creme of other countries? The Nigerian coming here to finish his doctorate in microbiology,
right? And then the Nigerian once he finishes his doctorate in microbiology, can then go work for Pfizer and become a U.S. citizen.
Yes.
So the other Anglosphere democracies, the United Kingdom, although they get a big asterisk because of the EU, but that's going to go away, which is another asterisk. Canada and Australia have what's called a points-based system. And this is what was proposed in that RAISE Act that Senators Cotton and Perdue introduced that I said we would get back to.
Yep.
The idea behind a points-based system is that the receiving country, that would be the United States, looks at the people petitioning to immigrate and looks at their economic qualifications, their likely social contribution, their age, because age determines how long you're going to be a productive worker paying Social Security tax versus how long you're going to be collecting Social Security payouts. And then, according to whatever schedule of points is issued, those with a sufficient number of points, they have advanced degrees, they speak the receiving country's language, they have only a spouse, they have, it depends on the precise schedule that's issued. Once you have enough points, then you are qualified to enter and receive permanent residency and ultimately citizenship.
Yeah. Well, now, just to say in passing here that, of course, there's also the issue of what the total inflow should be, and there's great controversy over that. But let's move on to our own specialty, which is the influencing groups. In this debate, it's not really just a two-sided debate; it's really a three-sided debate.
It's at least a three. You could even say 3.5.
Who would the first group be?
So the first group, or first and a half group, would be the restrictionist side. And kind of the larger faction, at least, in theory, are many of the more national conservative mainstream entities. Heritage Foundation and National Review Magazine are probably the two that are most prominent in this debate. But then you also have the sidecar of single-issue immigration restrictionist groups. Center for Immigration Studies, which does research on immigration levels. Numbers USA, which does advocacy and grassroots mobilization. The Federation for American Immigration Reform, which also does advocacy. And Californians for Population Stabilization, which is a state-level immigration restrictionist advocacy group in California.
And of course, that's intriguing because one doesn't typically think of environmentalists getting lumped in with groups considered conservative.
Yeah, population stabilization isn't exactly in the Heritage Foundation's mission statement, is it? And there's a reason for that, for those groups being in that kind of half faction. All of these four single issue groups, and a few others, it's not an exhaustive list, are backed by a fanatically pro-population control minority faction of environmentalists. The largest funder is a group called the Colcom Foundation, which is one of the Scaife family philanthropies, but not one of the ideologically conservative Scaife family philanthropies. It's the philanthropy of Cornelia Scaife May, who was a follower of and idolized Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger. Colcom itself has given a six-figure grant to Planned Parenthood of Western Pennsylvania, in addition to backing environmentalist groups like the Center for Coalfield Justice, the Community Environment Legal Defense Fund, and then these immigration restrictionist groups also get money from the Whedon Foundation, which is an environmentalist group that has backed the Natural Resources Defense Council, has funded the pro-abortion dissident nominally Catholic group Catholics for Choice, and even the militant atheist group Freedom from Religion Foundation.
So you could say these are the folks who are opposed to immigrants because they're opposed to human beings.
They're opposed. The funding organizations are opposed to people.
Yes. Well,
in fact, it was, according to the Los Angeles Times, it was said about Scaife May, the founder of Colcom Foundation, that she liked animals more than people, and that was by apparently a friendly acquaintance, according to the LA Times reporter.
Well, that's a line out of the Wall Street movie, as I recall, with Michael Douglas. But referring to my own ethnic group, the Wasps, they love animals, they hate people. He tells Charlie Sheen. But now the next faction in the broader debate then would be the more business and libertarian-ish sorts. And what can you tell us about them?
So the business community, the sort of Chamber of Commerce, Business Roundtable, American Farm Bureau Federation, generally favor expanded immigration. They like a large labor force. They like a ready supply of workers. They also favor a legalization of most of the current illegal immigrant population. It makes things administratively easy. They also get support from ideological libertarian groups, Mercatus Center, Cato Institute, philanthropists Charles and David Koch. And the libertarians, the philosophical ground is that a border puts an imposition on people's right to work and move about as they choose. You know, I am allowed as a citizen of the District of Columbia to live and work in Virginia, but I am not allowed to live and work in Lisbon, Portugal.
And that offends the
libertarian libertarian sensibility that people like. It's ultimately they see it as an ultimately arbitrary restriction on individual freedom. And then we also have the sort of the tech billionaire crowd who sponsor a group called Forward.us, which is stylized capital FWD.us, that advocates mostly for higher skilled immigration, but also for coalition management purposes, for a generally expansionist policy.
Yes, the Silicon Valley likes a particular type of visa for high-tech employees that they can bring over from places like India. Well, and then the third faction would be the left. And who are the leaders there?
They're exactly who you think you would be, who you think they would be. The big left-wing foundations, Open Society, which is Soros's principal funding vehicle, the Ford Foundation, one of the largest foundations in the country, Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation, which is one of Warren Buffett's many philanthropic vehicles, Tides Foundation, list kind of goes on. They, like the weird environmentalists on the restrictionist side, also fund a bunch of single issue nonprofit policy groups. The Migration Policy Institute, which is their research center, National Immigration Forum, which is their advocacy group, National Immigration Law Center, which does litigation, and the American Immigration Council, which also does policy research and advocacy.
Yeah. But that's not the only part of the left that's involved in these fights, is it?
No. You have the general multi-issue advocacy groups like the Clinton World think tank Center for American Progress. We'll get back to them in a moment. And also labor. The SEIU is a funder of some of those single issue immigration groups. NEA and Unite Here have funded the National Immigration Law Center. Labor, kind of like business, sees the opportunity, whereas business sees the opportunity for more workers, labor sees the opportunity for more members.
Yes, although I suspect that if you polled the membership of the National Education Association, many of whose members have to deal with school systems struggling mightily under the influx of immigration.
Well, then you get into coalition management, which we'll get to.
So, well, now, thanks for laying out the sort of the 3 or 3.5 parts of this jigsaw puzzle of influence. Obviously, when groups are jockeying for influence and trying to persuade the public, one of their favorite weapons is to talk about people who disagree with them's motives. And this is a particularly rich field for that in this issue area. So why don't we start with...
Part of why this is such a divisive issue is because just about everybody, thinks everybody else is behaving dishonestly. So the left-wing ideologues just assume anybody on the restrictionist side is racist or white supremacist or, anti-Latino or whatever the word of the day is. The Nation back in, I think it was June of 2017, published a piece that was titled "How to Fight Trump's Racist Immigration Policies." We don't even need to argue that they're that they are racist. Now, some of the behavior of some of the restrictionists, like Trump's comment that juxtaposed the world against Africa as a source of potential immigrants, does not help dispel that notion. Whether you believe that was his intention or not, it doesn't look good.
And then there's the business community.
Now, the business community has to play a lot nicer because they also want things like tax cuts and things like deregulation that Republican administrations, including the Trump administration, are likely to work with them on. So they tend to play good cop, it kind of is a good cop, bad cop dynamic with the far left. The business community its rhetoric tends to be more that the restrictionists are just wrong. If I may quote a Business Roundtable Chamber of Commerce joint statement, they will say things like, a 2015 report by the Chamber of Commerce showed that in the aggregate, immigrant workers do not depress the wages of American workers, nor do they take away jobs.
Yeah. That, of course, is probably the single most disputed. That question is extremely disputed on both sides.
That is, in many ways, the crux of all the debate, and the science is not helpful because it really depends on who you ask.
Yes, there is a George. One of the on the opposite side of what you just quoted would be George Borjas of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, who takes very much a different view.
Right. On the one hand, you have George Borjas, and on the other hand, you have, a number of economists who say that it's either a wash or that it actually increases native opportunity
in the long run.
At least in the long run.
Yeah. Though it's understandable, perhaps, that people in declining steel towns or other places would would struggle to accept that.
If the long run hasn't arrived yet, you can get a bit jumpy without necessarily having any malicious intent.
Yep. Now, what about the left-wing influencers in this debate? Their motives have also been seriously questioned.
Yes, the right, not without cause, which we will get to, tends to believe that the left is acting in a sort of naked partisan interest, almost like gerrymandering. It is not a secret that immigrants, at least in the first generation, tend to be left of center. Heritage Foundation immigration scholars openly said in an opinion piece that lower skill immigration, quote, arbitrarily shifts the political balance in the United States.
And that Center for American Progress that you mentioned a little bit ago, which has sometimes by its critics been referred to as the Democratic Party's PR firm, they had a little embarrassing leak recently suggesting there may be some truth to this.
So the Center for American Progress is 501c4 organization. The Center for American Progress Action Fund, which may be better known to the public as the publishers of the blog Think Progress, put out a memo, which was signed by a former Clinton campaign operative, that said that legalizing not just the recipients of DACA, but also anyone who would have been eligible under any circumstances for DACA, quote, or is quote, a critical component of the Democratic Party's future electoral success. Statements like that do very little to dispel the notion that that the ideological left-wing groups are operating in a partisan interest, and it gets more amusing. So NBC News, I want to say either early this week or late last week, ran a breathless story about Russian nationals who were coming to South Florida, and staying at, among other places, various Trump organization properties, to have their children in the United States, obviously under the current, I believe correct, I will not dispute interpretation of the 14th Amendment. Anyone born in the United States and subject to our laws, which is basically taken to mean not foreign diplomats who have diplomatic immunity, is a U.S. citizen. Many immigration restrictionists don't like this because it means that if you're a foreign national, you come to the United States, you have a child, now you have a tie to the United States. That child can't sponsor you for a green card until they're older, but immigration courts are loath to break up families for an entirely understandable reason. But it does, if you're an immigration restrictionist, which I'll be frank, I am not, creates a policy problem. So NBC News was breathless about the fact that Russian nationals were doing this, and some of them were staying at Trump properties. Of course, in 2015, they had bashed Jeb Bush, also not an immigration restrictionist, because he had expressed concern about how many foreign nationals were coming to the U.S. for what is often called birth tourism.
Yes, well, we should say that our friends at Hillsdale College would insist that the court's interpretation of the 14th Amendment on that question is not correct. And
I never denied it was disputed.
Yes, because it would seem that to take this example, if you are a Russian mobster and you happen to come to America in order to have your child, you're no more subject to the laws than the French ambassador's wife is if she happens to have her child in Georgetown at the embassy. But anyway, there's one more just to get all the accusations on the table. I think there's also the conservative accusations against the business community. And it's the motivations behind its desire for lots of guest worker visas and the like.
So you mentioned guest workers, so I'll throw a little asterisk there. The H visas, which are not technically immigrant visas, but that's a bunch of confusing legalese, which allow certain workers, it's like agriculture, high tech, and there are some low skill, but there are so few that it's almost not even worth considering for purposes of this discussion. One of the issues with those is that it ties a worker to a firm almost kind of as a semi-indentured servant. So some people, even who might otherwise favor high levels of free immigration, question whether the H programs are legitimate because they prevent the worker from engaging in free negotiation of their labor. But generally, again, we mentioned that one of the most hotly contested premises of the immigration debate is the effect of immigration on native worker wages. Restrictionists believe, understandably given the position that they take, that native worker wages are depressed, and that therefore the business community is secretly operating in the interests of lowering native worker wages. Again, the evidence is mixed, and it depends on who you ask, and it depends on the assumptions, and it depends on scale. I don't believe that either side is arguing this point in bad faith, even though ultimately, theoretically, only one can be right.
Yes. Well, and to get one, I want to put, before we wrap up here, I want to put one more motive accusation out there, which is whichever Democrat, and I think most people would put their money on Dick Durbin, leaked the president's scatological remark. His motive has been questioned because by that, and to be fair, in this town, it is unusual for such high-level negotiations to have such things leak out. There are certainly those who accuse Mr. Durbin of doing that in order to rile up their base and squash the possibility of some kind of compromise now,
of course,
so that a riled up base can then be driven to the polls in November.
Right. The question of do you want the issue or do you want a solution is raised, especially at the kind of organized left. Like the business community want a solution on their terms. I think that's generally clear. That's generally how they operate.
They don't have elections. They have quarterly earnings statements.
But it is true that for the left, having the immigration issue specifically as I have read that specifically as a motivating issue, the issue is not so much citizenship, not so much immigration levels, not so much, what restrictionists sometimes call future flow, the more immigrants coming in, as the dealing with the currently illegal population. Is your aunt who is not supposed to be here going to be sent back from whence she came? Congressman Gutierrez says, vote for me or else yes. Okay, I'll vote for Congressman Gutierrez, Democrat of Illinois. So again, the notion that, and especially with the prospects of a Democratic wave election where the Democrats, even if they wanted a solution, could negotiate from a stronger position, the idea that there would be an intentional attempt to scuttle is not out of the question.
No, that is certainly true, and I'm sure lots of motivations go into all of this. Dr. Samuel Johnson famously said, "All motives are mixed," and with that's
a good word to end on.
Yes, that's the right way to leave this very messy and hotly contested fight over influence on our immigration policies. That's our show for this week. If you're listening to this on iTunes or Stitcher, know that we broadcast a live video version of this podcast at 10 a.m. on Thursdays on Facebook Live and YouTube. You can find our pages by searching Capital Research Center. And if you're watching the video version, we encourage you to subscribe to the audio on your preferred podcast platform. We'll see you next week.